All right, umoya ulight, umoya ubright. I know a lot of you guys are going to be busy and distracted by Ramaphosa and Trump, but here at Moya, it's Black Wednesdays and we are at school. So whether Trump and Ramaphosa and whoever are meeting, that's their business. Our business is to learn our own history. As usual, we have Ndate Steve Lebelo, who is our teacher every single Wednesday for Black Wednesdays, and we've been doing the history. So I hope some of you guys have caught up on the other episodes. Now we're going towards the late 70s and early 80s, and we're going to learn about Botha and what happens in our history. Good evening, Dr. Steve. Thanks for joining us as usual.
Good evening, Tiki, and good evening to the viewers.
All right, we are ready for you. You can jump in and tell us where are we
Yes,
going
Tiki.
today.
Today we are going to be talking about P.W. Botha, but I just want to remind our viewers that there is a kind of a the lesson here has got a kind of a long-term objective, and the long-term objective is in fact to account for what I often refer to as the demise of the Black radical tradition in Black politics in South Africa. This is what this is about. And we have actually decided to name the series Black Wednesday because Black Wednesday is particularly significant, in the history of the Black radical tradition in the 20th century. In fact, Black Wednesday was in fact a turning point, because what it did was it marked a kind of a systematic assault, on the Black radical tradition. But it was an assault on the Black radical tradition's organizational infrastructure. So what was being attacked here were formal political, cultural, and religious organizations, that were the custodians and the bearers of the Black radical tradition. And maybe people can associate this quite simply with the fact that that Black radical tradition was, in fact, the Black consciousness philosophy. The issue here is that, the Black radical tradition had been a tradition since the early part of the 20th century. Those quite familiar, with the history of resistance to both colonialism and apartheid will understand that 1906 happened to be a turning point, and that's when Botha Rebellion took place. But beyond 1906, the Black radical tradition takes a particular form, and that form is mass mobilization of the people. And beyond Botha, the very first actually becomes Ama Israeli of Enoch Mgijima in 1921, an event that culminates in the Bullhoek massacre. But because what is at work here was a Black radical tradition, that moment is actually played down in history. Subsequent to that, there were other Black radical formations that emerged between 1919 and 39. And I'm not going to be going into those because they require a separate kind of, attention themselves. But the reality is that those two were played down, in the history of South Africa precisely because they were inspired by the Black radical tradition. And the Mpanza movement is the one that comes immediately after. Mpanza movement too has all the attributes, of a Black radical movement, but its representation in history was to, take away its Black radical component and character, and give it a kind of character that was completely an aberration. It was presented as a kind of an aberration in any kind of struggle, either for Black emancipation or any struggle at all, against colonial apartheid. So that has been the fate of the Black radical tradition. In the 1950s, it culminates with the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. And again, there you find a great deal of distortion, about both the character of the Sharpeville anti-pass campaign and the massacre that was, to follow. That too has been subjected to a great deal of misinterpretation, minimization, and also a great deal of distortion. So that has been the fate of the Black radical tradition. The 1970s moment represents the final, thrust of the Black radical tradition. And Black Wednesday would then represent that systematic assault on the organizational infrastructure of the Black radical tradition. And P.W. Botha is particularly central to that. But what we have to be able to understand and explain here is that P.W. Botha comes with a kind of, a kind of an agenda that is already set out. And it is when we have to, it is when we understand that agenda that we are going to understand P.W.'s role, in the attack on the Black and on the Black radical tradition. Historically, Nsiki, when people explain the transition from B.J. Foster to P.W. Botha, the one reason that is given as the primary, cause of B.J. Foster's downfall and the ascension of P.W. Botha to power. The one explanation that is given, I'm sure some of the people are familiar with this explanation. It is that, B.J. Foster was responsible for the information scandal, that the information scandal happened under his watch, and that is what was responsible for his downfall. But the reality here is that the information scandal may have been quite, a dramatic kind of an event, and no doubt it actually attracted the attention of the media, not only in South Africa, but globally as well. And therefore, it was certainly quite, a big issue on its own. But what was immediate, in the white, kind of mindset at this time is what they had actually encountered, in the 16 months between June 1976 and October 1977. The events of those 16 months taken together, would have generated a great deal of uncertainty and fear, in white society. Now, starting with the reason why we are unable to even think about the fear, that the moment actually generated in white society is precisely because that is a factor that was played down. Let me give you an example here. When people grew up, in South Africa and started learning about, the event of June 16, Hector Peterson sits at the center of that explanation. No doubt because what happened to him was brutally violent. But it's a fact, that there was a keenness, a kind of a determination to really sell the Hector Peterson story than sell any other story related to that event. No doubt, what the death of Hector Peterson actually showed was the absence of ethical and moral, standing of the white supremacist state. And that actually brought it into a great deal of condemnation, both inside the country and globally. But it is a fact that the death of Melville Edelstein was also a great deal, just in terms of the relationship between black and white in South Africa at the time. And there is no doubt, that the death of Edelstein would have registered in the white mindset, with the same kind of intensity that an earthquake of 6.5 magnitude would register on a Richter scale. That is how impactful the death of Melville Edelstein would have been. But the media in South Africa and the international media was not interested at all in covering the death of Edelstein, because any other extended kind of reflections on the death of Edelstein would have had the effect on spooking white society more than it already was. So this actually served apartheid securocrats well, to play down the death of Melville Edelstein. But it also served the purposes of those who stood to benefit, from Hector Peterson's victimhood, to play down Melville Edelstein. So for 30 years, no one spoke about the fact that Edelstein also died on the same day, as Hector Peterson. The issue here was that, what was being managed was white fear, because, white fear was actually becoming a factor, during the 16 months of unrest in Soweto at the time. There were two other incidents that I spoke about the last time out. And I said both of these, just in terms of their thinking, would also have registered quite significantly in the white mindset. And that would have been the events of August the 4th and the events of the 22nd of September. But the one thing that I really want to round off today, just to demonstrate, the extent to which the events of the 6 months between June and December 1976 would have ruptured any kind of relationships between black and white. And, I think here I may be, brave to say this was not only confined to Johannesburg or PWV area, because the whole thing actually reverberated across the country. So it was actually redefining black-white relations in ways that has not been accounted for. But I think I'm trying to account for that now. And the reason that has not, come in for discussion is precisely because white fear was being managed. But now the events of December 7, 1976 in themselves would have really driven, white fear, through the roof. And that had to do with the Chazibani affair. I have spoken about Chazibani's, plot to actually detonate explosives inside a crowded Carlton Center restaurant. It is quite clear, that between Chazibani and Isaac Seiko, who was supposed to carry out the task, between them, they had decided that their victims are most definitely going to be white. And that certainly was an attack on white people. Now, this is the sort of thing, in fact, if you think about Wellington Chazibani, I shouldn't be actually talking about him and people asking questions, but who is this? If you think about the enormity of his act, we should all know about him. But the fact that we don't, it is because his act is quite easily associated with the black radical tradition. And what you do with it is either to play it down or to misinterpret it, which is pretty much what was actually happening to the black radical tradition at this time. Now, there's another issue here about what was happening with the mass movement at this time. And that is that all of these activities that I've just described were actually planned, organized, and executed by Black people only. There were no non-Africans who were involved in both the planning and the execution, of all the events that I have just alluded to. That too was of particular concern to the white supremacist imaginary. Because what actually happened is that in each case, white society only found out the intent when the things actually happened. And that in itself was was definitely concerning, which explains why early in 1977, the white liberals were determined, to make sure that once again they infiltrate the Black mass movement. And for reasons that we've never been able to fathom up to this day, it was when the Soweto Student Representative Council, for the first time in more than a decade, came together in a meeting with a white liberal student body, NUSAS, that all of them were actually taken into police custody. And that was for the first time since the beginning, of the mass movement on the 16th of June, that the movement had anything to do with white people. And as I'm saying, to this day, we have never been able to fathom, what is it that would have driven, this particular executive of the SSRC to go into a meeting with NUSAS and with Vets SRC for that matter, because when they were captured, when they were taken into police custody, they were having a meeting with NUSAS and Vets SRC. And it was the entire SSRC executive. The effect was really, to undermine the student movement in Soweto completely. You can imagine the entire executive taken into custody. What it meant is that students had to start from scratch, and rebuild the organization. And this was going to happen between April 1977 and Black Wednesday, and when Black Wednesday actually happened. So the issue here is that the fact that the mass movement of the 1970s, which culminates in what I have already described, happening from the 16th of June up to the end of December 1976, all of that went into creating a kind of an atmosphere of fear. But once we went into 1977, white society was beginning to ask questions about the capacity and ability of the Foster administration to deal with this mass movement, because quite clearly they were not succeeding in doing so. Expectations were that once the entire executive of the SSRC was taken into custody, then the student movement would simply collapse. But that was not to be, because students were able to reorganize and establish yet another executive committee of the SSRC. And the president of that committee, who I'm going to be talking about a little later, and he actually becomes quite interesting, because we can compare the ways in which he dealt with the Urban Bantu Council, and the ways in which the councillors of 1984, only 7 years later, were dealt with by the mass democratic movement. I would love the viewers to bear this in mind, because later I'm going to be talking about, Transformasono's campaign against the Urban Bantu Council. Transformasono was, in fact, the last president of the SSRC, who took over after the entire executive was actually taken into custody. And later, we are going to be focusing on his term of office and what he actually achieved. But between then and Black October, Black Wednesday, between then and Black Wednesday, something actually happened. And that thing was, in fact, the Solomon Mahlangu story. Ntiki, I don't know, I just want to be sure that, I'm not talking alone.
I'm here. Sorry. Sorry, I am here.
Okay.
The audio is clear?
And is the audio quite clear?
Everything is perfect. I just wanted to ask, who's the white person who died when Hector Peterson died? What's his name? What's the story behind that? Because we're not that clever.
Let me explain that, Ntiki. The name is Melville. Melville as in the suburb Melville, next to UJ. And the surname is Edelstein. Edelstein is Edelstein, Edelstein. He's actually Jewish, a Jewish South African. And let me just explain, Melville was actually a medical doctor, who worked at the White City Clinic in Soweto. And over time, he had actually developed a relationship, with the community in Soweto, particularly around White City, and they knew him. So unfortunately,
is it the guy? I think you told us about him in the second episode, ne?
Yes,
the one that they tried to hide him and then they found him.
Yes.
Oh, did that happen at the same time as June 16?
Yes, in fact, the issue, in fact, it happened on June 16 in Siki, on the same day. Again, here, a distortion actually does happen here because what we still need to work out is who was reacting to what. At this stage, the orthodoxy is that those guys in White City attacked the clinic and wanted to drag Edelstein out of the clinic after they heard about Hector Peterson's shooting. Now, that's the standing explanation. But the other possibility here is that Hector may have been shot after Edelstein was actually killed. Now, the issue here is if the latter is true, it is all the more reason why it has to be distorted. I don't know if you understand, what I mean.
We are hearing you loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, so those distortions actually happened. And the next distortion that happens again, and this time, let me be brave to say, part of what we have to be thinking about is that the June 16 detachment, was made up of the class of 76. And these are people who came out of the black radical movement of the 1970s. Now, if we ignore the claims that there was an underground movement of the ANC that influenced these guys, or even if we allow for that to have happened, the issue here is that these people would have been socialized, in a kind of context where the black radical tradition was still alive and probably, still defining relationships between black and white. So part of what we see is that when they go to exile and actually join MK, they have to be deschooled completely. If there's any hint of them having that influence of the black radical tradition, of the black consciousness movement, that has to be taken out of their minds completely. And that involves, quite an involved process of deschooling and reschooling them in a completely new paradigm. And that paradigm is obviously Marxist-Leninist. So at the same time, Ziki, we are dealing with the critical question that you raised. What is it that concerned the apartheid state more? Is it the Swart Gefar of the black radical tradition, or is it the Roy Gefar, of the SACP-ANC alliance? In part, we are trying to answer that question. And which is why I'm saying I'm looking at white society at this time. And white society becomes a measure, of what is important to white people, what is the immediate threat. And quite clearly, the Koch Street shooting becomes the next, event and the next incident, that again illustrates the presence of a kind of a black radical thought in one of the three MK cadres, who were caught up in the Koch Street shooting. Now, it is a fact that a great deal of investment, has gone into centering Solomon Mahlangu as, the person around the Koch Street shooting. But if it is the killing that defines that moment, it is not Solomon Mahlangu who was responsible for that. It was Monty Mutlou. But until today, Monty Mutlou has been erased completely out of history. And the reason for that is simple. If you had centered Monty instead of Solomon Mahlangu, you would then have gone on to center the death of two civilians in all the discourses and the narratives, about the Koch Street shooting. Now, I'm saying the issue here is that at all times, the black radical tradition is played down. And doing that would have been, admitting to the fact that even within MK, cadres, there would have been those who came out of the class of 76, who were still the black radicals they were, when they left the country. And this becomes manifest in a number, of other campaigns undertaken by MK cadres, where there was no regard, for sparing white life simply because it was against the doctrine. Now, we can mention quite a few. In Sibasa, you had Mteteleli there operating there, and he probably didn't make any distinction at all. The Silverton siege and the death of the two white civilians in the Silverton siege is something that still needs to be interrogated fully. And again, there one begins to see the deliberate intent, to play down what could easily be an attribute of the Black radical tradition. Other examples I've given would have been of earlier campaigns, the Poto insurrection of 64 to 65, and the quietness with which 97 Poto operatives were actually executed at Kgosi Mampuru prison is also another indication of how the Black radical tradition throughout the 20th century was being played down, precisely because what it did was to accentuate white fear. So getting to 1977 and P.W. Botha, the last phases of that moment would have been when white society decided that the Foster administration has failed, to deal with the Black radical movement of the 70s, and they were looking for a substitute. The first thing they did was to remove Andre Fesser, who was chief of police in Soweto at the time. And he had to shoulder the blame for the failure of the administration to contain the unrest for over a year. And he was replaced by Louis Gerber, Brigadier Louis Gerber. And Louis Gerber, came with all his, brutal kinds of strategies that really began to, undermine the student movement. He introduced the dog unit as well as a sniper driving around Soweto in a green car and shooting people at random. Now, that really generated a great deal of fear and terror in students. And this was in August leading up to September. And then on September the 1st, and again here I need to explain this, high schools at the time were what I refer to as sites of struggle, locations of struggle. So if you wanted to really put an end to the mass movement of the 1970s, high schools would have been the place to target. And next to that, it would have been the universities. But the workplaces too, were drawn into this as a result of the stayaways, that were called in 1976. So here I'm trying to account, for what actually happened to the Black radical tradition until Black Wednesday in October. But in August, the student movement was on the retreat. And it is at this point that Rafomosano came up. He was already president, of the Soweto Student Representative Council. And he decided that the one issue that we can deal with, is to quietly approach the Urban Bantu Council. And again, I'm going to emphasize this. These were our parents, the mayor, Ntate Tolika Makaya. They were parents, but they were part of a system that we had come to resent. The idea here was that we're not going to attack them, and actually burn down their homes. We were going to have a discussion with them, and they would, probably see the point and they would dissolve the Urban Bantu Council and resign themselves. The meeting that actually orchestrated that, so that it was a historic kind of thing, and the meeting that actually.
Sorry, Tata Steve.
Yeah.
Stelubuza, what is the Urban Bantu Council?
Oh, by the way, yeah, let me just explain this very quickly. After Black Wednesday, in 1978, they had to reconstitute what we refer to as local government in the Black townships. Now, the Urban Bantu councils were established with the apartheid state after 1948. Before that, local government structures under the Johannesburg City Council and the United Party, they were referred to as advisory boards, but they were the same things. They were structures that were responsible for local administration in the townships. Mpanza was actually a member of the advisory board, but he was also a leader of a party that took part in the advisory boards. Then after 1948, these were reconstituted and referred to as the urban Bantu councils. And because they were created by the apartheid state, we referred to them as, we referred to them as toy telephones. And we never listened to, any other instructions that came from them. But while we understood that they were saving the system, we also were mindful of the fact that they were parents. So we were able to gather them at Madibane High School. This was sometime in August 1977. We were able to bring them together at Madibane High School and prepared a statement that dissolved the Urban Bantu Council, and all of them resigned. So from August 1977 until January 1978, Soweto had no local government structure because the Urban Bantu Council had been dissolved. That's what the Urban Bantu Council is. And Trofomo Sono was actually responsible for that. But as I say, high schools were sites of struggle. If you think about it, the mass movement from the 16th of June until Black Wednesday in October was actually sustained by high school students. There is a sense that probably if high school students did not sustain the movement, it probably would never have gone on until the end of 1976. But it did precisely because the students kept it going. And it is for that reason that the high schools actually become the target, for the apartheid state. And they decided that all Soweto high schools from the 1st of September were going to be, taken over by the state. And all high school students in Soweto were supposed to then go to an office in Boysen where they would reapply. And on reapplying, they would be placed by the officials in any other school. But that in itself was a deterrent. Few students would have ventured to go to that office, for fear that for one reason or the other, you might be taken into custody on suspicion that you did something or the other. So in itself, it meant that yet again, an academic year has come to an end. So 1977 was the second year when the academic year actually collapsed. And I think I want people to bear this in mind because we lose sight of this. The issue here is that between 1975 and 1982, Soweto high schools never had a decent matric exam being administered. And that all had to do, with the unrest of 1976 and the reaction of the state to that unrest. And that reaction was now a systematic attack on the high schools, both on the teaching personnel and on the student body of the Soweto high schools. I often say that if you go to any high school in 1981, you will encounter students who never had any institutional memory of what was happening in 1976. It would not have been surprising for students not to have known who Tsietsi Mashinini was, because that, in fact, was the design, of the apartheid state at this time. So high schools are taking over on the 1st of September, 1977. Yet again, a systematic assault, on an organizational structure of the Black radical tradition or the Black radical movement, which is the high school students and the Soweto Students Representative Council. 11 days later, on the 12th of September, Steve Biko is murdered, And again, this is yet again an attack on the Black radical tradition. That is well documented and that is understood as precisely that, an attack on the Black radical tradition. And then that culminates, in Black Wednesday on the 19th of October 1977. Organizationally, that brings to an end, the presence of a Black radical formation as a significant factor in the struggle, against colonial apartheid. And from this point onwards, the struggle is redefined. It is no longer it is no longer a struggle for Black emancipation, but new definitions of the struggle actually enter the equation. And going into the 1980s, it is not the Black radical movement, that is dominating the political scene. If anything, the Black radical tradition is just as much subjected to a systematic assault, not only from the apartheid state, but also from the politics of the left, that are a think tank of the mass democratic movement. And maybe for taking a few minutes just to, end it there a little, and then we can talk about whether there are any questions I need to respond to.
So far, I don't see any questions. I always get the feeling that we always just come here to come to your lecture and listen to what you have to say. So, so far there's no questions, but we are following and we are listening.
Okay. So, by the end of 1977, then, with Black October, as I said, organizationally, the Black radical tradition has actually, experienced a systematic assault. But something happens immediately thereafter, and this is before P.W. Botha comes to the scene. Now, early in 1978, an attempt is made. In fact, first, AZAPO is established. Now, AZAPO is actually an attempt to try and revive organizationally a kind of a Black radical movement. And Lebon Mabaso and Ishun Kabela get together with a few others, and they, cobble together a movement that they refer to as AZAPO. As I say, this was an attempt, to revive a Black radical political formation. And soon thereafter, another student body is actually established, and it is called the Soweto Students League. And that too is actually, modeled as a kind of a Black radical kind of student formation. But let me say this quickly about the Soweto Students League. Once the security police heard about it, they went hammer and tongue against the leadership. And these guys had to flee Soweto and they went to Bloemfontein. 3 of them actually went to Bloemfontein. And thereafter, SSL was just unable to operate and it was dissolved. But once these guys got to Bloemfontein, they actually found a situation where students in Bloemfontein were also somewhat restless and, were looking for something to really do to confront the system. And what happened is that the 3 guys arrived and they started organizing students in Bloemfontein. And they established the Bloemfontein Students League, which was seen as a continuation of what they had in Soweto. And within a few weeks of their arrival in Bloemfontein, the city went up in flames. Students went on the rampage, stoning, municipality cars, burning down buildings. And it was a new unrest in Bloemfontein. It lasted for more than 3 days. And for nearly 2.5 weeks, Bloemfontein was in turmoil. Now, of the three guys, one was actually shot and killed in Bloemfontein. And the other 2 were able to escape and they went to Lesotho. And the 2 that went to Lesotho were Opa Mlangeni and Teboho Mremi. But then here is something quite interesting, because this is where the student movement inside the country, gets to make connections, with students in exile who did not join the ANC or the PAC, who were on the verge of establishing an autonomous student body that would be called the South African Youth Revolutionary Council. Now, when Opa and Teboho arrived in Lesotho at the time, there were already, plans to actually establish SEICO in Lesotho, but it was yet to be formally launched in Lusaka, Zambia, during the Easter weekend of 1979. So by the end of 1978, and at the end of that unrest in Bloemfontein, a lot of the Bloemfontein students were actually in Lesotho, and they actually did become members of the South African Youth Revolutionary Council going into 1979. And just in terms of numbers in Lesotho at the time, at any time after the arrival of this cohort from Bloemfontein, SEICO had the largest number, of exiles in Lesotho at the time. And this was all because, the class of 76 that became members of the ANC in Lesotho by this time had actually been taken out of, the kingdom and had actually gone on scholarships to West Germany. So that actually led to serious tensions between the ANC in Lesotho and SEICO, because the ANC was worried that it was being upstaged by SEICO. Now, again here, for some reason, it happened, and I'm not going to go into the details of what happened in this particular case, but there was a great deal of disgruntlement inside SEICO that was in fact fueled, by other people coming from outside. And the long and the short of it is that SEICO lost an entire membership to the ANC. And, a lot of those Bloemfontein students by 1980 had actually become members of the ANC in Lesotho. And that is how SEICO actually collapsed, in the mountainous kingdom. But at the same time, Kgotso had actually come back to Botswana after the establishment of SEICO, the formal launch in Zambia. And I think I did actually explain this, but once again, let me just put this quite clearly, because what we are seeing here would be the last stages of a Black radical student movement. Now, what happens in 1980 is that Kgotso Seatlholo encounters some students who came out of South Africa, particularly from Soweto and Diepkloof. These were students who were members of the Methodist Church, a youth guild in the Methodist Church. They were on an excursion in Botswana, and they came across Kgotso Seatlholo. Now, let me just explain that one of the things that SEICO, in fact, was keen to do was to return back into the country as soon as it was possible to do so. The understanding here was that if you go back to 1960-61, that's when the ANC and the PAC actually went into exile. And the historical reality is that for the 15 years between 60 and 75, there was very little evidence of what was happening in exile, in terms of what the ANC and the PAC were actually doing. And conversations inside SEICO were that is not going to be the case, because there is a need to keep constant contact with what was happening inside the country. Now, that was quite a daring thing to do. But Kgotso was prepared to do this. And the opportunity was, gifted to him when this group of Methodist Youth Guild students arrived in Botswana, and he was able to make contact with them. And the arrangement here was that Kgotso was going to travel back to South Africa during the first school term, break of 1981. And that actually happened, during the school break of 1981 in March. Kgotso arrived back in the country. And clear, SEICO did not want to stay another 15 years in exile without making contact, with people inside the country. So Kgotso returned. And the idea here was to make contact with those students that he had met in Botswana in December. The long and the short of it is that, unfortunately, police were informed about Khotso's presence at a certain house. Later, it came out that the house was actually in Orlando, and that is where Khotso was taken into custody. And, after that, he was actually put on trial. At the end of that trial, Khotso was sentenced to 14 years in prison, and that was in 1982. What that actually signified was the end of a Black radical student movement that came out of the Black movement of the 1970s. The capture of Khotso and his incarceration signaled the end of that movement. But inside the country, I've already explained that an attempt was made to establish yet another Black radical student formation. That was the SSL. But I said, apartheid state security came down on it like a ton of bricks, and they finished it, within a wink of an eye. But a year later, yet another student movement was established. And that student movement became the Congress of South African Students. But that COSAS was actually allowed to exist. A friend of mine, when I explained this to them, said to me, it is because COSAS was actually vetted by the state. Ntike, how are we doing for time?
Oh, we're doing fine because I get my next program is on at 8. So
Okay,
you're getting
how
into
much time do
something
we have?
quite juicy. What do you mean COSAS was vetted by the state?
That's interesting. I mean, compare and contrast the ways in which, the government dealt with the SSL. The kind of ferocity that was demonstrated, in dealing with the SSL was not demonstrated in the case of COSAS. But what is important here, Ntiki, is that, and this is not actually, a kind of a figment of the imagination. This is actually providing the evidence, and the evidence points to the fact that the state was particularly concerned, about any kind of Black radical expression, rather than it was, about any other kind of radicalism that was not Black radical. And still, I'm still trying to deal with your question. Is it the Roy Gevaar or is it the Swart Gevaar that was of particular concern, to white society in general and to the apartheid securocrats in particular? And I think the evidence that I'm marshalling is demonstrating the fact that, it is the Black radical tradition that was, targeted here. I often say that so much investment was mobilized, investment in intellect, investment financially, and institutional investment in the destruction of the Black radical tradition. It is therefore not surprising that for the past 4 weeks, it has been a struggle just to, explain what the Black radical tradition is. But if you went to other parts of the Black world, in the US, for instance, the Black radical discourse, is a dominant discourse among Black people. But, since Black Wednesday and beyond, the Black radical tradition has been taken completely, out of a political discourse, any political discourse at all. So it is not surprising today that when one tries to explain what Black radicalism is, one really has a mountain to climb. The interesting thing is that when people get frustrated about the system, it is only then that they begin to reflect on the possibility conditions that the Black radical tradition may have provided at some point, and which explains why, at some point the fees must fall and the roads must fall. Movement had to use Biko as a kind of symbol. And one gets a sense that, there may be a kind of an affinity that they sense, with Biko, but there is also a sense that there isn't an understanding, of what actually happened to the Black radical tradition. And I think this series is an attempt, to account for the demise of the Black radical tradition. I see a question here. I don't know if it's a question. There's something that
Yes,
is it a question?
yes.
Yeah.
It's a question. Can you see what it's saying? What eventually happened to Tebogo and Opa?
What happened to?
What eventually? It's actually two questions. The first question is what eventually happened to Tebogo and Opa, and then okay, let me let you finish. Let me let you answer that.
Yes. Now I'm going to have to reveal the fact that, this is an autobiographical account. I don't know if you get what it means. In fact, Opa and Tebogo were received by me, when they arrived in Lesotho. And we were in the process of, I didn't actually want to, I didn't want this to center around me, but, to answer that question, I think that has to come out. When they arrived in Lesotho, we're in the process, of forging Seiko, and we're in the preparing, to attend a conference in Lusaka in Zambia, where we were formally going to launch Seiko. And this was going to happen during the Easter weekend of 1979. Incidentally, and I think this is going to be important for future discussions, Seiko was actually formally launched before the formal launch of what became the Black Consciousness Movement of South Africa, which was established by Musibudi Mangena in exile, also I think in Lusaka. But, in the build-up, towards the conference in Lusaka during the Easter weekend of 1979, more people came into Lesotho, young people who actually, became members of Seiko. I don't want to get into the details of what actually happened with Seiko in Lesotho, but at that point, it had actually become, in terms of membership, Seiko had actually become the largest formation in Lesotho, at least for that short duration. Like I said, that, there were influences that came from outside. Unfortunately for the Lesotho delegation, we were actually expected to attend the launching conference in Lusaka, but we were denied, exit by the Lesotho government, and we couldn't go. But when, at the end of the conference, more people came into Lesotho, particularly those that were in the National Executive Committee of Seiko. And one of them was actually Majaka Tata Mokoena. Now, the long and the short of it is that tensions actually surfaced between Majaka Tata and the membership, of Seiko. And I said, quite a good number of those members came out of Bloemfontein as members of the Bloemfontein Students' League. But the tensions between Majaka Tata and the membership, is something that we tried to manage. But ultimately, quite a good number of the members felt they couldn't actually tolerate him. The long and the short of it is that there were other outside influences. These people were being recruited quite clearly, and they were actually being, given promises of things that they would actually receive. And we know that for, for a fact. And that is how we actually hemorrhaged membership as a result of, either Majaka Tata's irritation of the membership, but also the fact that, some of the members had already been influenced, to leave the movement, and they did. Now, the interesting thing is that once Seiko was dealt with in Lesotho, what it meant is that, the Bloemfontein guys and the new arrivals in Lesotho at this time would have come out of the Eastern Cape, because it is there where in 1979 there was an unrest led by the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization, of Tozamile Botha. And, those would have been the two sources that actually, gave more refugees of young people, into the liberation formations in exile. So remember that in 1982, the SADF actually launches a raid into Lesotho. And this is something I have never been able to establish, and I still need to do that to find out whether among the casualties, actually 30 of the South African exiles, were killed in that raid, and 12 were actually Basotho nationals. But of the 30 that were South African exiles, I think I've actually explained here that by the time the Bloemfontein cohort arrived, the class of 76 that was in Lesotho between 78 and October 76 and October 78 had left on a scholarship. So if 30 people got killed, it is possible that some of them would have been those that were SEICO members in 1979 and had actually been recruited into the ENC. But the other possibility is that these were new recruits. Among them, there would have been new recruits that came from Port Elizabeth, because it is there where there was, a measure of unrest between 79 and 1980. Upamlangeni died a few years ago. I think he died sometime in 2018 or 2019, of an illness. But he did come back into South Africa. And I'm not too sure if he did actually finally join the ENC. And Teboho Mremi, I'm certain, he did actually join the ENC. And I think much later he probably did actually undergo some military training. I don't know what finally happened to him, but it is safe to say that, I was walking downtown one day when I encountered Teboho Mremi, and he wasn't quite forthcoming about what he was doing at the time. But, he certainly was still, connected to the ENC at this time. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does. And then the second question was, why did ANC Lesotho take the scholarships to Germany?
Ntiki, this is, okay. Again, that gives me an opportunity to explain something that's absolutely important here. The establishment of SEICO wasn't the first attempt, to establish a student movement in exile. The cohort of 1970, the class of 76 that went to Lesotho, you still had quite a good number of those, who did not join either the ANC or the PAC, and who still felt that there was a need to establish an autonomous student body, outside South Africa at the time. And remember here that the same thing was actually happening in Botswana around this time. There was quite a good number of students who came out of Soweto and other parts of the Witwatersrand, Gauteng today, who were already, aware of the kinds of conversations that were going on about the exiled movement. And they too were not prepared to join either the ANC or the PAC. This was particularly the case in Lesotho and Botswana. So in 1978, it was sudden, suddenly there was an offer of a scholarship from Germany. Now remember, in 1978, Germany is still divided into two. You have West Germany with the capital in Bonn, and you have East Germany with the capital in Berlin, a city known as East Berlin. Now, the issue here is that West Germany was aligned to the West, and East Germany was under the Soviet sphere of influence. The curious thing about the scholarship is that it was given by West Germany to students in Southern Africa, and this included students coming from Zimbabwe at the time, who were aligned to either ZAPU or ZANU, as well as students who came from Namibia, who were aligned to SWAPO. Now, these students actually took up the scholarships, to go and study in West Germany. What was curious here is that West Germany was actually responsible for undermining economic and cultural sanctions against South Africa. Germany was actually in the forefront, of bankrolling South Africa at the time when sanctions were actually imposed. So for some of us, the issue was, and also if you think about it, the issue here was that there were too many South African young people, exiles, who were meeting around South Africa's borders. That in itself was of particular concern to apartheid securocrats. Although the 1970s movement had been contained, no one could predict when another mass movement would erupt. And if that happened while there was still quite a good number of South African students meeting around South African borders, that in itself was posing a security threat, even though it may have been a future security threat. And they probably had to deal with it at that point. This generosity from Helmut Kohl. Helmut Kohl was the German chancellor at this time, and a very close friend, it was known, of B.J. Foster. So it is possible that, this was a kind of, a strategy to get South African young people away from the borders within reach of South Africa, just in case another mass movement erupts and you have people in the know about what is happening in exile. So that was the problem with this scholarship. But unfortunately, more than 80% of the class of 76 in Lesotho at this time took up the scholarship, which explains why, when the Bloemfontein Students' League cohort arrived and became members of SEICO, SEICO became the largest group in terms of membership in Lesotho at that time. And let's bear in mind here, the end of, organizationally again, the end of the Black radical movement can then be put down to 1981, when SEICO ceased to exist. Because beyond that, you do have a mass movement, as I pointed out. But this was a mass movement driven by the mass democratic movement, a movement that was antagonistic to the Black radical tradition. Let us bear in mind here, it is difficult today to speak to young people about the Black radical tradition because so much has been invested in its destruction that it is almost, impossible to pinpoint what it looks like. But for those who may want to have something that comes closest, to a Black radical today, particularly in international politics, Traore seems to me, to stand out. And I'm not saying he's the ideal Black radical, but at least he gives you a sense of what Black radicalism in its depth would be. And that is what it is, pointing the middle finger to the West. Anyone who is capable of doing that and can afford to, without having to go cap in hand to the West, or without even wanting to engage the West, gets closer to being a Black radical. Are there any other questions, or should I don't know.
Oh, you may continue. There's no questions at the moment. Guys, I do urge you to please bring in your questions because that Steve is a well of wisdom. And that Steve, you can continue. I wonder when you're even gonna get to Botha.
So, in fact, Ntsiki, I think, okay, let me just explain this. I said, let me just go back to that initial explanation very quickly. I said, just in terms of the historical orthodoxy, when you explain the transition from B.J. Foster to P.W. Botha, the explanation is the info scandal. But the explanation is the info scandal precisely because of the design, the intent to actually underplay, downplay the significance of the Black radical tradition. What actually leads to the transition from B.J. Foster to P.W. Botha is, in fact, a search for someone who will deal with the Black radical movement of the 1970s. And P.W. Botha presents himself as someone who will be able to do that. So what I've done so far is to show that there was reason and cause for white society in South Africa to be particularly concerned about Black radicalism. And they had to find a leader who would be able to deal with this. All of these events, the Black Wednesday, the murder of Biko, the crushing of the SSL, all of this is in fact a systematic assault, on the Black radical tradition. When P.W. Botha comes into the picture, what we will be seeing is a systematic assault, but this time it is carried institutionally. There is the institutional reimagination of the South African public sphere, and that is actually done to institute an anti-Black dispensation. And once again, we shall see that it is the high schools, it is the universities, it is the workplaces that are coming under attack. And that becomes P.W. Botha's agenda. What I'm saying is that once we start discussing the 1980s and P.W. Botha is in the saddle, what we will be seeing is that, an institutionalization of an anti-Black dispensation. And this becomes P.W. Botha's thrust. It becomes his agenda. But what is P.W. Botha doing at this time? He is telling those who want to listen that his agenda is in fact to contain the ANC and MK and SACP's total onslaught. So what he's saying is that it is the Roy Gevaar and not the Swart Gevaar that he's going to be paying attention to. Yes, he says that, but what he goes on doing on a day-to-day basis is to construct and develop an anti-Black dispensation in South Africa. That manifests itself not only in relationships between Black and white. The anti-Black dispensation actually manifests itself in relationships between Black and Black. And that becomes the genius of it. It is almost like turning the 1976 Black radical movement on its head. And that is what, P.W. Botha actually achieves. So the reason why I really want to go back to this background is not to look at the 1970s movement in relation to or in terms of Black society, but to explain, how it impacted on white society and how white society responded, to the threat of the Black radical tradition. But I also want to impress it upon the viewers here that throughout the 20th century, it has been the fate of the Black radical tradition that it is either misinterpreted or minimized, and therefore, when I say COSAS was vetted, it is precisely because at its inception, COSAS distanced itself. On the day it was founded, it distanced itself from the Black radical tradition by adopting the Freedom Charter. When it adopted the Freedom Charter, it assumed the charterist character, which was an antithesis to the Black radical tradition. And that is why I'm saying, on the basis of the fact that COSAS was turning its back on the Black radical paradigm, it was therefore vetted by the apartheid state.
Yes, we are listening. We are here.
Oh, okay. Now, Ntsiki, let us bring in a couple of other related issues, related to the theme that we are dealing with here. And this is where the Credo Mutra, now I hope the viewers are going to have a sense of the context and the period. COSAS is formed in 1979. And at this stage, Credo is still inside the country. I think I've explained the fact that there's one thing that defined the Black radical movement of the 70s. Let me just repeat this because this is my own formulation. It's not, I didn't read this anywhere. It is my own reflection on what the movement was about. And I always say, according to the movement, no political objective was worth pursuing if its realization was dependent upon the visitation of violence on the black body. That is what defined the black radical tradition of the 1970s. And throughout that movement, there was never any instance where we could even entertain the idea of black on black violence. It was completely, inconceivable in the context of that time that it could happen. But from 1980 to 1982, something actually happens in South Africa. And this time, it is a kind of an unrest, but it's an unrest in workplaces. It is the emergence of trade unions. Trade unions are emerging not because of struggles within the workplace, for recognition of trade unions. Trade unions were emerging because the government was advised to legalize trade unions. This was an advice from US security agencies that it would be good enough to establish trade unions so that you can contain the kind of unrest that you are unable to deal with. And trade unions were established. And I still think we really need to have a serious discussion about the disruption that trade unions would have had in the momentum that the black mass movement of the 1970s would have had. The other thing is that the epicenter of the trade union movement actually becomes Western Cape, and Cape Town in particular. And the movement then spreads to the rest of the country. But the issue here is that the definition of struggle was changing quite rapidly. And the idea that the struggle was for black emancipation was, gradually taking the back seat, and new categories of struggle were emerging. The interesting thing here is that, those involved, activists, had to explain who the enemy is in this new struggle. And interestingly, in some cases, they had to do it in African languages. And they were saying things like, the antagonism is between umqashi and umsebenzi. It is no longer between black and white. And Melville Alexander was at the center of this, ideological, shift, from black emancipation, to a new form of struggle. But that, in fact, was a build-up towards the creation of the mass democratic movement. So in 1982, it is actually a trade unionist, Neil Agat, who actually gets killed. Interestingly, and once again here, I'm not too sure if I'm repeating this, but it is important to restate it anyway. There were conversations going on among political activists at any time, one could say, between Black Wednesday and 1983, when the UDF was established. And the debate had always been about the advisability of including white people in black struggles. And that became, the debate between black radicals who had seen to be extremists and those inside AZAPO who were beginning to soften up, and, beginning to see non-racialism as an answer. And where did these new AZAPO people came from, who were beginning to, toy or in fact to flirt with the idea of a non-racialism? Mostly it was those that went, to Robben Island for, say, about 4 or 5 years, probably from 77 up to 1980. And they were coming out of Robben Island already having been influenced by the dominant ideology and paradigm and tradition in Robben Island, which was the Charterist tradition. And they would include people like Musiwa Lekota and, a few others. Eric Molobi, for instance, would be one of those. Mefi Morobe would be, among those. And for them, making that transition from a black radical paradigm, to a Charterist or non-racial paradigm was actually a sign of maturity. You were more mature, if you did that, and you were less mature if you stayed black radical. So in a sense, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that black radicalism was not only attacked, by the apartheid state and the white liberals, more importantly, but it was also attacked by, the white left, the white radical left, or white Marxist Leninists. And it is the Marxist Leninists who were then providing the vocabulary and who were dominating the discourse of the mass movement of the 1980s. Now, any suggestion that the violence of the apartheid state was actually directed at black people for being black people would not be quite honest, because the reality here is that there was one target that was being looked at here. It was the black radical, persona that was coming under fire. The interesting thing is that there are people who were taken into custody and probably even killed at any time between 1977, Black Wednesday, and the formation of the UDF. And I always argue that if someone was actually being killed before the formation of the UDF, it is possible that for the apartheid securocrats, this was a mopping up operation of all those people that were deemed to be black radicals, and this may actually have happened even beyond, the formation of the UDF. I would still argue that even inside the UDF, there were those that the apartheid state securocrats would have suspected of harboring the black radical, kind of sentiments and inclinations, and they had to deal with these people. And they did so. I'm not going to mention who I suspect may have been dealt with precisely because they were still black radicals at heart, but because the organizational, the organization that was there, that people could join, was actually the UDF. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that in the mindset of the apartheid state securocrats, they were still going out in search of black radicals, even within the Charterist movement itself. I still suspect that there are people there whose articulations, when they spoke in public, were still black radicals at heart, and the state had to deal with these people. Once again, I'm going to remind you, that it is hardly surprising, that it is so difficult to speak of the black radical tradition in South Africa, and yet, in the black world, in the US, in lecture theaters, in schools, in fact, in the US, it is condemned as critical race theory by white powerful interests. But in South Africa, we shouldn't be having a problem. In fact, if you think about it, any intellectual and political discourse in South Africa need to be centered on a black radical paradigm. The fact that it isn't is an indication of just how intense that systematic attack on black radicalism was. The matter of Biko, the Black Wednesday, and all others were only the beginning. The real hard work actually happened in the 1980s. And it is then that, the black radical tradition was completely obliterated. If we stop here, we can then start with 1983 and the formation of the UDF, and we can show how, P.W. Botha then achieves, and again, let me just point this out. Remember that it is P.W. Botha who decided to establish the tricameral parliament. Now, yet again, you may wonder how this is an attack on the black radical tradition. Black consciousness defined itself as an organization of those who were politically, socially, economically, and culturally discriminated against. That definition was a broad definition of blackness, and it included colors and Indians and Africans. What does P.W. Botha do? he actually attacks that definition, and he offers to the colors and Indians an opportunity to walk away from the black identity, and he offers them a place in a white parliament. We know what the reaction of the Indians and colors are, to this attempt by P.W. Botha to split the black radical, movement. A part of the colored and Indian populations, take up the offer, and they become members of the House of Representatives and the House of Delegates for the Indians, and they participate in the political processes. But part of these communities do not actually become part of this P.W. Botha process. Instead, they opt for a different kind of radicalism. What do? They join the UDF. So, in a sense, either way, the black radical tradition loses. They don't, the Indians and coloreds, by their own admission, decide to walk away from that broad definition of what blackness is. And if they become radical, they become UDF. And if they become collaborationist, they join the House of Representatives and the House of Delegates. And I think next we are going to look at, the UDF, P.W. Botha. The idea here is to get to an explanation of where in the black radical tradition Marquis Kosana sits. And I think that is going to be, our next discussion.
Yes, that's actually what it was supposed to be. But before you go, can I just engage the last comment here? Uh,
Yes.
prior to the Freedom Charters Foundation, what was the document which Black radicalism was structured on?
There would be various kinds of documents that would have come out. I think if one goes back to the earlier period, the 1950s, you have the PAC manifesto. And the PAC manifesto, which in fact be a kind of a doctrine, that would have been Africanist, in terms of its character. But again, here we are saying Africanist because the period is the 1950s. The same tradition, and I think I really need to impress this. It is the same tradition that emerges in the 1970s, except that this time the label is Black consciousness. So at some point, we will have to be able to deal with that. But in terms of Black consciousness, I think, well, there are a lot of documents which actually explain, what Black consciousness is. The Saso Constitution, which was adopted in 1969, spells out in detail, what Black emancipation actually entails. And I think that is a document that we can go to, and examine fully to be able to understand, what the Black, agenda was here. But here is the most important thing, Nsiki, about the Black consciousness movement and the Black radical movement of the 1970s. There is no doubt that Steve Biko's Black consciousness provided the philosophical foundations, of the Black mass movement of the 1970s. But those were a set of ideas. These are ideas that had to be tested, in a real world, in a concrete context. And I'm going to use a word and explain what that word means. What those ideas needed was a crucible. A crucible is a place where ideas are put to a test with very exciting. The crucible is. Black consciousness was a set of ideas. It needed a crucible that would test the validity of these ideas. For reasons that are historical, I'm going to explain why Soweto provided that crucible. there will be a time when I will take time off, and explain why, not only Soweto, Kwatema in Springs, Takani in Brakpan, Mohlakeng in near Randfontein. These are historical communities that in themselves, and the ways in which they evolved, as urban communities, provided the setting, for Black consciousness to germinate and to thrive. So if you think about what Black consciousness stood for, my answer would be that while it started off as a set of ideas put out there by Steve Biko, it was actually enriched along the way by the ways in which it was appropriated, by those communities, whose constitution provided the crucible. And I've mentioned what those communities were. This is not to suggest that they were the only. What I'm saying is that in the context of that historical moment, it is these communities that provided a crucible, for the Black consciousness, philosophy as a Black radical paradigm. So what I'm saying, therefore, is that in the ultimate end, it may not be a kind of a written constitution of this is the Black consciousness philosophy. On the contrary, a lot of it derives from practice. What is an example of one practice? One example is what I've given today. We cannot kill Ndade Tolika Makaya because he's a mayor of Soweto. What we do is we talk to him and he resigns. That in itself is a very important principle of the Black radical movement. What I'm saying here is that, like the British Constitution that is not written, that is based on practice, Black consciousness was being enriched by practice. As people encounter, particular situations that need political resolutions, they were able to come up with creative, kinds of solutions that enriched the philosophy. So in that sense, we don't have a freedom charter. The Black radical formation of the Black consciousness variant did not produce a kind of a constitution. It was actually based on particular practices, which were found to enrich that philosophy. I hope that actually answers the question.
Yes, and then I suppose this is where you'll start next week. Mandisa is saying, can we draw parallels between PW's total strategy and what we experience as systematic racism in modern day South Africa?
P.W. Botha's strategy, was to deal with what P.W. Botha's strategy was to deal with Black arrogance, what he would have understood as Black arrogance. Now, I know this is going to rub other people up the wrong way, but the whole idea of non-racialism exists where Blackness does not exist. The idea of non-racialism is the assertion of whiteness and, the pummeling, into nothingness of Blackness. That's what non-racialism is. And yes, P.W. Botha's, total strategy was an attack on Blackness. And what was that for? That was so that any kind of post-apartheid dispensation that may come about would come about in a context of what I often refer to as Black is always absent, even when it is present, and that white is present even when it is absent. Now, today, that's the race relations that we have in South Africa. Black is absent even when it is present, and white is present even when it is absent. That is why in the delegation today, we have John Steenhuisen.
Yeah, bo, correct. Ooh, hey, okay, thank you. So, Ndate Steve, does this mean that
Rupert too.
does this mean that Black Wednesdays is moving to 6 p.m. on Wednesdays.
You know, the reason why we did 6 p.m. last week, by the way, was because of the anticipated load shedding. But if people are comfortable with 7, it's fine.
I'm actually comfortable with 6 because it gives us more time, because my other program starts at 8.
Okay. Okay. No, that's fine. No, 6 will be okay then, so long as everybody else is happy with it.
And then can we say thank you to the crew?
Yay!
Yes, it's the quality is so much better. Thank you so much to the
Okay.
brothers.
Okay.
Thank you. You looked very,
Okay.
very nice. And we always
Okay.
love to
No.
see your nice outfits.
But you said I can't see you. You said, oh, you said I can't, but you can see me. Oh no, that.
Yes, I can see you. You can't see me.
Oh,
I'm Big Brother's
okay.
eye. There are
Okay.
comments saying
Yeah.
that 6 p.m. works for us. So moving forward, we do this at 6 p.m.
No, that's fine. Yeah, it works for us too.
And your children are saying thank you so much. There were 375 of them in class today.
Hey, I'm happy with that. I'm actually flattered. Thanks, Ziggy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you guys at 8 o'clock for Moya Political Series. And thank you for always
And
supporting the channel.
who do you have today, Ziggy?
Today we've got Wandile Zaza. He's going to speak about men's issues.
Okay.
So, yeah, what is affecting the black man?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now we
Yes.
tune in. Okay. Thanks,
Thank you
Ziggy.
so much. Shab
Okay.
shab.